for the kind introduction. Thank you, General De Silva, for the invitation, and the Sri Lanka Army. Thank you in particular to the organizing efforts of General Jayasekara and the entire Sri Lankan Army. This has been a very interesting and remarkable meeting for me anyway. As General Bilton mentioned, we had a day yesterday that was focused primarily on the academic, analytical side of things. When I spoke to some generals yesterday and asked them what they would like me to speak about, since I have sort of three hats here, I'm a professor teaching at a university where I teach issues on conflict resolution. I'm also a board member of the President's Office of National Unity and Reconciliation here in Sri Lanka. And I work in a foundation that tries to facilitate dialogue between armed groups, governments, and the UN in different parts of the world. All these generals said, look, we are interested in your practical experience in different parts of the world. That would be most interesting to our officers and to the people here. So I decided to drop my more academic talk and focus more on this, because I think it would be useful for you to hear, particularly those of you who are engaged in different ways, both in countering violence, but also possibly in working with the UN and international efforts to try to end conflict. The organization I work for is called the Dialogue Advisory Group. It is based in Amsterdam. I'm the director. And the way we describe our work is we say we facilitate dialogue between armed groups, governments, and UN to reduce violence. We don't say to achieve peace, we say reduce violence. So we have a bit more of a modest goal. We're working in different situations. We work with the Basque separatist group ETA, armed group ETA. We work in Northern Ireland with dissident Republican groups. You'll be surprised that in Europe there are still indigenous armed, some people call them terrorists, others freedom fighters. We use a neutral term, armed groups. In Europe, not just the radical Islamist violence that we hear about. We also work in Libya closely with the UN and helping them talk to some of the radical Islamist groups that control Tripoli. We work in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I'll give you a little example of what we do in each of these places, and then go a little bit into the methodology, how we think about our work, and then maybe try to connect it a bit more to the panel discussion more broadly. In northern Spain, for example, in the Basque Country, we have formed a monitoring committee to monitor ETA's ceasefire and to push it towards disarmament. The monitoring committee includes people primarily from military security background. So it has, on the committee, we have the former Deputy Chief of Staff of the Indian Army, General Satish Nambiar. We also have the former head of Minister of Intelligence and former Deputy Defense Minister of South Africa. Before that, he was head of intelligence of the armed wing of the African National Congress, Ronnie Casrills. We also have on this Mr. Chris McCabe, who used to be the governor of the Maze prison in Northern Ireland, and then political secretary at the Northern Ireland office for the British government, quite involved in the Northern Ireland talks. And so in northern Spain, in the Basque Country, over a period of since 2011, we've been engaged in a dialogue to try to get ETA to do two things. First is to declare a unilateral ceasefire. So in other words, stop killing, bombing, threatening, and doing illegal taxation. And secondly, to begin a process of disarmament. 2 years ago, at an undisclosed location in Europe, three of us witnessed the sealing of a first batch of weapons. It's controversial, the work we're doing. Some of the victims' groups have opposed it. They have said that we are giving recognition or giving too much legitimacy to ETA. We felt it was useful to push them. This is a unilateral process. It doesn't involve concessions from the official formal talks. It's a unilateral process, but at the same time, the Spanish government quietly supported an appeal in the Spanish Constitutional Court to allow ETA's armed wing to take the ban away and to allow it to function as a political organization. We'll continue with this work. The second area where we worked in is in Northern Ireland. Many of you know about the Good Friday Agreement. And with the Good Friday Agreement, the main Irish Republican paramilitary group, the Provisional IRA, signed the peace agreement and came and agreed to end violence and set aside its weapons. It gave its weapons to a commission, an independent commission headed by a Canadian general. But while this was a major success, there still were what were called dissident Republican groups. These are groups that are smaller, more violent, that opposed the Good Friday Agreement. They accused Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness of sellout, and they continued to bomb and kill. We were asked by one of these groups about disarming and engaging, but they didn't want to engage directly with the British government or do what the IRA, Provisional IRA, had done. We approached the British government, got their cooperation, and set up a process where they would again transfer their weapons to an independent group that would then transfer it to the De-Chastelin Commission and destroy it. Subsequently, the same people asked us to assist in resolving a conflict in Northern Ireland's Maghaberry prison between the dissident Republican groups and the prison authorities. This was a dirty protest that involved various violent plus unpleasant acts. The British government was then very open. They allowed us into the prison, myself, a trade union leader, and head of a foundation in Derry. And we negotiated an understanding about what can be done. While the Good Friday Agreement has led largely to peace in Northern Ireland, it is important to note that there is still a significant threat for the UK in Northern Ireland. In fact, on a regular basis, there are bomb threats and successful efforts to stop this. I heard, I don't know how accurate this is, that almost a half of the UK's intelligence budget, domestic intelligence budget, is still spent on Northern Ireland. I think there are people here who have a better view of this. So this is the work we're doing in Northern Ireland. In Libya, we've been assisting the UN in engaging with what some people would call the hardline Islamist armed groups in Tripoli. Recently, last year, there was a Libyan political agreement that was signed. It was somewhat controversial in the sense that not everybody was on board. Nevertheless, the UN went ahead and appointed a government. This government went to Tripoli in April this year. At the time of the appointment, there were different sides that opposed this government. We had been approached by these Islamist radicals in Tripoli. We contacted the UN. They said, go ahead and engage them. We contacted the UK and US governments, as well as other governments that had interest in the issue. And they broadly supported our efforts. And we managed to bring together defense attaches from key governments along with these Islamist groups so that they would understand the concerns on both sides, and also facilitated discussions between these groups and the UN security team. What we told the UN and members of the international community that if you want to go to Tripoli with this new government in a non-violent way, without a fight, then you need to engage with them. So you can either go to Tripoli with a fight or without a fight. If you want to go with a fight, you'll need a massive force, you'll need a lot of help. You're not going to there is no appetite for a huge force to go fight its way into Tripoli and install a government, so you'll need to find a way to engage with them. What we told the groups was, you have an option. Yes, you don't like this government, we understand. You think it's illegitimate, not properly set up. You have an option of either fighting the government or staying out and expressing your opposition to the government in non-violent ways. If you fight the government, you will be isolated, banned, and you will have to fight a lot of different forces in the world. If you stay out of that and say you oppose the government but you will not fight it, you have the potential to influence it later on, or if you choose at some point that there is a breakdown, you can still fight it in the future. So you have to decide, it's your decision to decide which option you want. We also engaged the UN and suggested that they allow for a space of what we call neutrality among the different factions. That is to say, you don't have to support the government in order to be not treated as an enemy. That is, we'll be neutral, you can be involved in engaging and influencing, but we don't expect you to sign on to the agreement. So this is the kind of, just to give you a flavor of the work we do in different places. And in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we're also working with a couple of significant armed groups. In every place we work, we go with government permission, and obviously with the permission of the armed groups. Let me say a little bit now about how we think about our work. That is the sort of, in social scientific jargon, methodology, how we approach it. We make, I would say, three distinctions. One is a distinction between goals and methods. Objective is something you want to achieve. A method is how you achieve it. The second distinction in our engagement we make is between what we call a very biblical distinction, the sin and the sinner. And a third distinction is between non-violent extremism and violent extremism. So let me just unpack briefly how we approach this. What do I mean by the difference between goals and methods? Let's take separatism, or efforts to set up an independent state. You have a separatist party in the United Kingdom, the Scottish Nationalist Party. This party wants to have a separate Scotland. The leader of this party meets the EU. The leader of this party engages with British politics. That party has people in the British Parliament. They lobby, they advocate, they win votes, and they push for a separate Scottish state within a democratic framework, non-violently. It's completely legal, and it's part of the politics of the United Kingdom. Now, ETA is pushing for the same goals, separate state for the Basque people, but it's doing it through violent means, bombing, killing, threatening. The methods it uses are violent and harsh. And so what we focus on is the methods. We don't get into a debate with these organizations about their objectives. The objectives could be Islamist, Marxist, separatist. That's for issues to be politically resolved through dialogue within the political systems of those countries or with the leaders of those governments. What we focus on is the methods. That's why we say reduce violence. So what we say is, why do you need to use violence in this way? Is it getting you what you set out to achieve? Why don't you find other means of pursuing your goals? Now, this methods and goals distinction is often confused. It's confused both by those who oppose these groups and are seeking to fight them, but also by the groups themselves. They think these objectives can only be achieved through these methods. And so we try to separate the two and press them on this issue. The second distinction we make is between the sin and the sinner. I'm a Hindu, I'm not a Christian, but I find this a very important, useful distinction. What do we mean by this? People do nasty things. Sometimes even good people do nasty things. When we meet these groups and we talk to them, we don't condemn the person. But at the same time, we're completely blunt and we don't censor ourselves in condemning what they do. Whether it is violence, whether it is killing of a particular sort, whether it is killing of civilians. So we're quite blunt in that. And we think this distinction is important because in some ways, political violence, unlike other forms of violence, let's say criminal violence or sexual predatory violence, political violence is easier to get out of once a decision is made provided, of course, you have a coherent organization with command and control, than other forms of violence. And we find that if a decision is made, and if they shift out of it, they can actually make this transition, or at least do things that are less bad. And this is an important distinction between what I call the sin and the sinner. The third distinction is between nonviolent extremism and violent extremism. And I'm going to say something that might be a little bit counterintuitive. In the conference and in general, I was actually at a summit on countering violent extremism in the UN, chaired by President Obama, where the UK Prime Minister David Cameron spoke up and said that we must not only fight violent extremism, we must fight extremism. I disagree with that. Let me say what I mean. A few years back, I was talking to an Indonesian general in charge of counterterrorism. And we were chatting, and he said, you know, Ram, we like extremists. I said, what do you mean? I was also a little surprised. I said, what do you mean? He said, extremists are 50-50. I said, explain to me. He said, when we are dealing with violent Islamist radicals in Indonesia, he said, I'm an Indonesian general, I'm a Muslim, I drink. When I meet them and talk to them, they say, you're not a Muslim. You drink, you don't do this, you don't do that. So you're not, I can't argue with them because their views, their way of approaching it is completely different from mine. So I cannot really persuade them. So therefore, what I find is if I get an extremist who is non-violent, who is opposed to violence, that extremist is better able to argue with them than I am. And so we find in our work that getting extremists who are non-violent, engaging with them and getting them to support the positions we take can be extremely helpful. For example, in the Basque country, our key allies in pushing ETA to give up violence were the Basque radical nationalists who were associated with ETA but opposed to the violence. They were pressing ETA saying, look, this is not working, we are not making progress, why are you continuing with this? You must stop this. And they helped us in convincing and getting this organization to stop and unilaterally cease fire. Now, you might ask, why do they listen to us? Why do governments, why do armed groups listen to us? We are a small organization. In Amsterdam, we are people from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Europe. Half women, because we find that women are smarter at listening and collaborating and very helpful in these settings. Why do these armed groups and governments listen to us? What is in it for them? As opposed to, say, getting a UN or a government to engage. From a government's point of view, they like us. Why do they like us? Because we don't have political costs associated with the engagement. For example, a government can ask us to contact a group. Unofficially, we do it, we come back with messages, but we don't give, because we are not an official entity, we don't give that group any recognition or legitimacy by contacting them. And even if it leaks, the government can say, yeah, there are organizations, civil society, NGOs, humanitarians going all over the place. This is just one more. So they have plausible deniability. And so they find us to be useful in this regard. Secondly, they also find us useful because if you have an official mediator, let's say the UN, you might be condemned or criticized if you don't do what they say. If it's the EU, they might have economic sanctions. People are particularly afraid of the US. If it's the US, they may do something more. So they prefer to have a non-governmental mediator. This is also true for the armed groups, although generally armed groups prefer to have an official mediator because they get some status from it. But they understand that when the government says no, that they have to engage with the unofficial mediators instead, or the unofficial go-betweens. Now, how many more minutes do I have, Greg? I'm okay? 1 minute, okay. Let me, given that it's, I have 1 minute, if you don't mind, I'll take 3 minutes. And let me say, what does this have to do with soft power, and global issues. The way I see it is I would say that we're using soft power, a form of dialogue, to deal with hard power of non-state violence. So a global issue of armed groups that are now proliferating in a particular part of the world. I think it's a swathe running from Pakistan to Nigeria. And these groups are a problem. And the question is, can we use a soft power method of dialogue to engage these groups? And we are. How does this connect to the discussion we've had about power and its different forms? I actually want to go back to before Joseph Nye and refer to a book by Stephen Lukes. It's a Marxist view. In the 70s, he wrote this book, Power, a Radical View. And he mentioned 3 forms of power, which I think are interesting. And I'll explain a little bit where our dialogue and how it fits in. There's the power to get somebody to do something that you want, but they don't want. So in the case of an armed group, you want to get them to give up their guns. And you use the military to force them to take the weapons away from them or defeat them militarily. And that's a hard power. That's one power. The second power is agenda setting. That is, a person's interests remain the same, but you set the agenda. So this is often what diplomats, UN will do. When you have an official mediator like the UN, for example, there are limits to what the UN can allow in a dialogue, in a negotiation. They set the agenda. So to give you an example, the UN is a member state organization. So when the UN facilitates a dialogue between a government and an armed group calling for separation, separation is off the table because the UN will not accept the change of borders today. So that's agenda setting. Or the UN government can't say, I want to keep a military dictatorship, because the UN conventions and others are committed to certain forms of democracy. So a military dictatorship in permanent is off the agenda. So diplomats have power to set agendas. That's a different power. Your preferences don't change, but you're set to the agenda of the discussion. We come to this conference, we have views, we'd like to talk, but the agenda is set by the conference organizers, who is speaking, who gets to ask questions. So that's agenda setting. The third form of power that Stephen Luke spoke about is the power of changing the thinking, changing the preferences. And changing the thinking is a complicated process, and that's what we work on, changing the thinking and the preferences. Now, to be clear, Lukes is a Marxist. He had a particular view about it, false consciousness, that it's some kind of conjurer's trick or magic. I think he was wrong on that. The people we meet, armed groups, and on the other hand, interlocutors tend to be military intelligence chiefs and other side armed groups, sometimes security advisors to the president. They are not fools. These are smart people. So you can't fool them. When you're talking to them, you can't pretend something else is happening and saying this is what. You have to be very straight with them. They immediately know if you're, pardon my French, BSing. They can figure it out. So you have to be very straight with them. So it's not about a false consciousness or lying. It's about presenting options and showing some options that may work and others that may not. So I want to be very clear and say our work alone will fail, will completely fail, if there isn't these 2 other things going on, the force and the threat of force that changes the preferences, and an officially recognized process at some point that allows the work we do informally to be taken up and formalized. Thank you very much for indulging me, and I look forward to the discussion.